And
Thank
it
you.
then brings us nicely on to Neal Cook, Professor Neal Cook's presentation. Neal, I also have had the pleasure of knowing for quite some years, as I did my doctoral studies at the University of Ulster, where he is currently a professor and the head of the School of Nursing and Paramedic Science. He's also Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, for those of you who may be familiar with that, and has led a team to achieve the Silver Award, and I think it's the Silver Award for the School Athena Swan. Not something I'm familiar with, that may be something for the UK world. In terms of his background, he's obviously he is a nurse, still practicing, and his particular field of interest is neuroscience, and wherever that may be possible to exercise and practice that nursing. So Neal, it's over to you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Sean. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, and you can see my slides okay, yeah? Lovely, okay. Well, thank you, Sean, for that introduction. So yes, one of my passions is neuroscience nursing, and the other big passion is person-centered practice, as probably quite a few people will know. And I suppose the previous presentation was really helpful in terms of leading into what I'm going to talk about, and even some of the questions that came afterwards. So it's really nice to be able to follow that presentation. So I'm going to talk about developing person-centeredness in the curriculum, and really talk a little bit about the person-centered curriculum framework, but how also we've applied that successfully at Ulster University and other person-centered frameworks in that goal of pursuit of person-centered practice through developing person-centered practitioners, namely nurses and now also paramedics as well. If I can get my slide to move on, there we go. So I'm just going to talk about the contemporary challenges of achieving person-centered practice, and I think that's something that most people will be familiar with, indeed from some of the comments that came after the last presentation, and how we do that through education, so that we establish flourishing practitioners and we create that culture of person-centered practice from the outset, and try to grow that culture. And I want to talk a little bit about the underpinning philosophies and the models, and then lead us in then to talking about a universal curriculum model that has the flexibility to be applied across different kinds of curricula, different structures, and different countries from the work that we have done. And so I suppose most people will be familiar that humanizing healthcare is a very important strategic focus globally. We see that now in government policies, we see it in lots of elements of practice standards. We're seeing it come into curricula, we're seeing it being, I suppose, led in a number of areas to challenge what we do in practice and to lead us more towards being person-focused and to create that more humanistic culture of practice. And so we know that there's a need for person-centered approaches, and that should be at least at the core of healthcare delivery. So that is the aspiration, but it's something that we've to continue to strive towards. And we know that educating healthcare professionals is fundamental in creating those healthcare practitioners. So we could start with practice, but we could also start with education, and address them both together, so that we create the dynamic that really fosters person-centeredness in everything that we do. But we also know that few curricula embrace person-centeredness, that this is really, I suppose, an emerging phenomenon in a number of places, and in some areas it has been very well embraced over the last decade. But we still, I suppose, could see a lot more of that. And so there is a need to take really an underpinning philosophy and a whole systems approach to education and to practice by starting with education. And really, I suppose that leads into really talking about a definition of person-centeredness, because we need to establish where we're coming from, the culture that we're talking about, what we really mean by person-centeredness. And we're very reliant on the McCormick and McCann's definition from 2010 because we feel that really it succinctly presents what we believe person-centeredness is, and the values and culture that surround that. And it's an approach to practice established through the formation and fostering of healthful relationships. And I was intrigued by, I suppose, one of the previous comments around us developing curricula, and talking about person-centeredness and then sending people out to fail. And I think that's absolutely right. And those healthful relationships mean that we have to have authentic collaboration with practice as well as education in developing those curricula. And so when we talk about practice in this definition, we also see education as practice and the importance of those healthful relationships between all care providers, service users, and others significant to them in their lives. It's underpinned by values of respect for persons, individuals, right to self-determination, mutual respect and understanding. And again, we believe that applies equally to the students that we support in their education. And fundamentally, it's enabled by cultures of empowerment that foster continuous approaches to practice development. So what has become very clear in recent years is that we can talk about person-centeredness, we can put things in place, but if we don't address culture, we're not going to deliver on it. And that includes educational culture, as well as practice culture, as well as how we set policy, standards, everything. So it's across the board. We need to look at that culture and challenge that culture. So you will be aware, obviously, of the different frameworks that we have, and you'll be aware of the person-centered nursing framework and the person-centered practice framework. And those at Ulster have underpinned curricula since 2010, and we've delivered a number of pre-registration programs, undergraduate programs, as well as post-registration master's programs, postgraduate certificate programs, etc., based on these models. And they have worked very successfully. In fact, we've got two pedagogical research studies that demonstrate that these are the first curricula, known curricula in the world that there's any evidence published on that actually develop caring attributes and person-centered attributes over the period of the program based on those two practice frameworks. So we do know that it can work, and it can work very, very successfully, but we know that the underpinning approach is very, very crucial to how that's done. And so the philosophical principles behind that are really important. And I just want to flick back to the previous slide. So we know then that traditional approaches don't always work if we just try and replicate what we've done before and not challenge our thinking. So anytime that we're using any of these frameworks, we need to almost set our curricula aside and start completely with a fresh approach and start to map these frameworks, not just throughout the curriculum document and the modules and courses that people will do, but into the culture in the school, with the teaching team, so that you create the full curricula in its widest sense, so that it underpins what we're going to do, and that we live out the values and how we support students in their education, both in the university and in practice. And that means we need greater agility, and we need frameworks that are going to be agile and work with the different systems and the restraint that you get from university systems quite often to be able to do that. And so we did obviously look at some of those principles in our Erasmus Plus work, where we identified co-construction, relationalism, pragmatism, and transformation as being fundamental underpinning principles. Without bringing those principles in and in how we develop and design the curriculum and deliver and evaluate the curriculum, we felt that the evidence would suggest, and our practice colleagues would suggest, that we're unlikely to be successful. So our goal then was, as part of that Erasmus Plus project, to develop a universal curriculum framework with the agility to work synergistically with existing curricula in developing person-centered healthcare practitioners. So we knew we could not just come up with a model that would not facilitate something agile, that would recognize that this is a journey, that we need to recognize that this will take time to develop culture, to develop, I suppose, a supportive framework, both within the university and in practice for areas where this is new, and areas where, for like ourselves, where we've been doing it now for well over a decade, we still see that we're in that growth phase, but we're positively growing. But we needed to make sure that any curriculum framework we develop would be agile to work with the other existing curriculums and any restraints that come with that. And so we did this, I suppose, and cognizant of a number of different things. We needed to operationalize this in a particular way. So once we had a framework, we needed to consider how we integrate this in. So we looked at things like our collaborators and our strategic partners. So we looked at things like our external examiners, our professional body representatives, our regulatory body representatives, those who commission programs, and also who develop practice standards and the strategic direction for nursing and healthcare in Northern Ireland. We looked to our colleagues in our international community of practice, and then obviously we worked with our Erasmus partners as well. But we needed then to take that down to a more granular level. So while we had those strategic partners there, we needed to include all those collaborators, and particularly we needed to make sure that we had people and their significant others in there. But students, if you read most educational philosophy, would say if you start to design educational curricula without students, then you're not really going to be as fundamentally successful as you could be. So they need to be in there, but so do our practice partners, so do our healthcare managers, so do our business support, our technicians, because all of those people create the realities of delivering on the curriculum. And if we don't engage and bring them in, we are not going to realistically be able to deliver. It becomes too idealistic, and that's why the pragmatism element is very, very important. But we also had then our operational group in our school, and we then focused on curriculum development with all of these partners, strategic partners and collaborators. We needed to demonstrate our leadership and be political and strategic in how we delivered on these curricula. We needed to influence people's hearts and minds to take this forward, but we also needed to underpin our approach with our research and the available research out there. And so we did have a number of streams of pedagogical research going on in the background, as well as practice research, but we also looked at what other evidence was available in order to develop those curricula. And ultimately, they were to lead to developing person-centered healthcare practitioners. And so you'll see on the next slide then, this is the person-centered curriculum framework. And on the next slide, I'll give you the references so that you can go away and read about this in a little bit more depth, and the journey that we've all been on through more depth. But really, crucially, the framework is made up of the 7 S's from the McKinsey framework, 7S framework, interlinked with those philosophical principles of pragmatism, co-construction, transformation, and relationalism. And so it's not just about what we do, but how we do it. And the 7 S's will take you along to enable you to look at those specific areas and make sure that you're picking them up. So you can read about that more in those 3 papers that I've cited there on that slide. Now, the next slide very briefly just shows you some of the work that we did in the beginning. So we felt we needed to think about what and how do we want our students to be, and what would a supportive environment look like. And you can see there's a number of things that came up. So we knew that we needed to be brave, and that we wanted our students also to be brave, to be able to ask questions and engage in conversations so that they could have those critical thinking analysis skills. We wanted them to be able to think creatively, but we also knew that they needed to be able to deal with ethical issues, work within teams, harness their own autonomy, be advocates, because they're also the change agents of the future. They need to be able to promote the culture that they want to work in as well. But we recognize that they need to be able to operate in a context where things are challenging, but we want them to be able to work in partnership using reciprocity. We want them to be able to consider those multiple perspectives, explore them, consider them, and have a real world understanding of where they're going to work. Have a shared vision, but also see that all people need to be empowered. If I take that further then and apply some of the 7S's, I'll give you some of the things that we questioned around our curricula. So the first one's on strategy, the first S, and this is about identifying the USP of the program and what makes it attractive to potential students. So we wanted to make sure that we had a clear understanding what person-centeredness is. What do we mean by it? What are we expecting by it in the curriculum, so that we can articulate that clearly and focus our curriculum on developing people who are person-centered. We needed to develop a program that can adapt across changing healthcare contexts. We know that healthcare is rapidly changing, and so our programs need to be able to rapidly change. But fundamentally, we needed to be strategic. We needed to make sure that we had all of those influential people in the room, those who set policy, those who deliver in practice, who lead in practice, who fundamentally influence and change practice, our students, our those who support our students and our educators, so that we had a strategic approach in co-creating the curriculum. I'm going to flip just to another S just to talk through it. So I'm going to talk about the systems approach. So we wanted to consider things like ensuring the philosophical principles of personhood are apparent. So they're explicit. They're not something that you have to weave through and try and figure out if they're there. They need to be explicit within the program. We wanted to make sure that the pedagogical values and practice that guide the curriculum are also aligned with person-centeredness. We also want to consider what curriculum quality systems and control do we need to be mindful of. So we can set up a curriculum and we can start to deliver a curriculum, but if we have no way of monitoring and looking at that curriculum and quality assuring it to see that we are actually delivering against that person-centered philosophy, we can lose focus. So we need to be able to track the progress of students, but not just of students, of ourselves as educational practitioners, and be able to see that we are actually delivering on a person-centered curriculum and be able to challenge ourselves. So we can't just sit back and assume we're successful. We need to make sure that we are being successful. So I've left in the presentation just for everybody who is attending to be able to see some of the considerations across all of the 7S's, but I won't go through them all in the presentation just due to time restrictions. And I just really want to take us to other considerations that I think are really important to consider. So I think whenever you're going to deliver on a person-centered curriculum, you need to think about what you can achieve in your timeline. So sometimes we've got short deadlines, sometimes we've got quick turnarounds on curricula. We're responding to maybe service demand, and sometimes it can be quite ambitious to think that we're going to deliver this perfect person-centered curricula. So think about what you can achieve in your timeline and then be realistic and strive for it. This is a journey. You're not going to achieve everything on the first parts of that journey, but we have to start the journey and start moving towards it. You'll always have opportunity to come back and revise and change your curricula, make small changes, major changes, work towards reapprovals or revalidations to make, significant changes that you learn from your first delivery. So I think it's important not to think that this has to be perfect on the first go. And I think the third point is to remember the curriculum is more than the document, it's around the culture. And I suppose if I'm going to give an example, we recently had a program approved using this curricular framework, and it's a postgraduate diploma in specialist nursing practice with integrated prescribing. And I think it's probably one of the most successful program approvals we've had in my time in the university, which is just over 20 years, in terms of the number of commendations and the authenticity of delivering on a person-centered curricula that came through. And it really was down to thinking wider than a course document. It was thinking about those elements that I mentioned earlier, about being strategic, about focusing on making sure you've got that authentic partnership, all of those people involved, that the systems, etc., are going to that are needed to support a curricular in place, that there's complete buy-in, etc. And we had students, we had people who use services, we had people from policy making policy, people who support these students, all coming in at separate times to meet this panel to be able to demonstrate and articulate the level of passion and buy-in that they had to that curriculum, and that's thinking about it wider than the document itself. And then finally, just really to lead to any questions, and just to, I suppose, cite that we are really proud that we got a collaborative award for teaching excellence for our work in person-centeredness over the last 20 years, really, from both the practice and education elements. And I think really why I'm highlighting that is that you can achieve this. This is achievable. It can be delivered upon very successfully, and it can influence education, it can influence strategic policy drivers, it can influence practice, but it does take that leadership and commitment, and I think the bravery to move it forward. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you for listening. I'm very happy for any questions.
Okay, thank you, Neil. As part of the project group, it was a really interesting journey, and you've given us a good foundation to look more closely and more deeply at the publications that are around that project. But Joanne's dying to ask you a question. She's stuck her hand up really quickly. So I'm going to give the floor to her now.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Morning, everybody. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Neil. That's got my brain ticking nicely today. I'm thinking about this on a regulatory perspective. So for nursing and midwifery in the UK, we've got the Nursing and Midwifery Council. And when you look on their website, they talk about person-centeredness, person-centered nursing, person-centered midwifery. But when I dig a little deeper and when I speak to them certainly around advanced practice, I don't think they're there yet. I don't think they still really get it. And I am concerned about the hoops that we have to jump through, and certainly that QMU had to jump through, I suppose, to become a person-centered curricular end-to-end. And I'd love us to think as a collective about how we work together on this so that we can influence our regulators. And I'm not just talking about practice regulators, but I'm talking about health and care regulators as well, because person-centeredness and person-centered care is banded around quite freely, as if it's a thing and people understand it. But as soon as you start talking to people, it's not. And we still go back to patient and the patient and all of that. So I'm really excited about this work. I've started using the 7S framework because of this work. It's been so influential on me personally, so I can't thank you enough for that. But it would be great for us to think towards the end of the day how, whether we can do some specific work on influencing and maybe writing for the nursing and midwifery or other publications in a plain English way, in an easy read way, I suppose, so that we can get students and early career healthcare professionals to start questioning why their curricula isn't person-centered, because I think we've got to have that kind of squished top and bottom and middle. So I just think it's a wonderful piece of work, and it can't have come quick enough for me. So thank you.
Thank you. I think, Joanne, you make a really good point. And so I think the strategic element is very important. I suppose why I mentioned one of those. I mean, we had Anne Trotter sitting at the table as we designed this curriculum, and we had Anne Trotter from NMC telling us this is the way the standards were to be interpreted. This is how they see them delivered. They wanted us to showcase our curriculum. We were very nervous about that because it was the first one we were putting through to be picked up that way. But I think that's part of it. I think the other thing was we actually found that in doing this, we took a regional approach, and so we had another university present who was challenging even some elements of our practice portfolios to say this isn't person-centered enough. And they were doing that based on the previous work that we'd done with our pre-reg curriculum. And I thought this was fantastic because it meant we'd now influenced regionally, we had created that culture. So I think it is about the collaborative elements. It's about moving beyond the boundaries, not seeing ourselves in competition, starting to work together. And that has been very, very successful. And then I think, Tanya's obviously on the call here, but Tanya takes some challenges back in at a strategic level as well. So, in Northern Ireland, the nursing strategy, workforce strategy is underpinned by the person-centered nursing and practice frameworks. So it is about getting that whole systems, I think, approach, but there is a lot of challenging in there, and I think it's the high challenge, high support element that we have to bring in, and it isn't easy. I think that, you know, while we can present it all as lovely, it isn't easy, and you have to keep going at it as a journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. And I think to keep it as inclusive as possible, that the way the term person-centeredness is used in terms of educating future practitioners, in the way you educate them and what you expect them to be at the end of it, is maybe not just a UK phenomenon. And maybe there's some other people in Europe or even the Southern Hemisphere who can maybe share some of their experiences, or maybe they have already been successful in influencing regulators to use the term person-centeredness in the way that it should be used, dare I say, or that has more meaning than just a term that they can banter around. Anybody from the room to give a different perspective?
I'd like to make a point, Sean.
Yeah.
Neil, thank you for that. I'm going to raise this point later in my paper, but it's pertinent to raise it now, is that, as I see it, that in order to guide or teach nurses to be person-centered, the teacher has to themselves know person-centeredness, not as a theoretical idea, but as something lived. And it does make me think about, do we need a return to the lecturer practitioner to be able to sort of fulfill that idea? That's it.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, one of the things we've done in our school is that we have kept our we have a linked lecture system, so we see very much that we're very much still in practice while we're in there with an education focus. We work very closely in partnership with our practice areas so that we keep in touch with what we think person-centeredness is, and we do pick that up on our educational audits as part of our philosophy. So I think that we do have a number of lecture practitioners. I don't think that they are more in touch with what person-centeredness is than those who are not in those practice roles, because I think that what we do a lot of work on is we make sure that we embody the principles of person-centeredness and what we do. Now, I spend a lot of my time challenging our approach to education, and you know, we've been really on a culture change, and we had to do quite a culture change project. But I think we also have to look at the experiences of our students, and how we treat our students, how the system treats our students, how practice treats our students, to really understand it as well. But what we have found is that the core component from the study that both myself and Dr. Deirdre O'Donnell completed, and now work that another PhD researcher, Shauna Dugan's doing, is that reflective practice is something our students hated and didn't find really any value in, if I'm being really honest. And from introducing this as a curriculum framework, that has flipped that on its head, and they see it, that critical discussion with us, with their practice partners. So they do not complete their practice learning elements anymore with us signing them off. It's the practice partners, obviously. I know that's throughout the UK, but the engagement element and the authentic engagement element around the reflections is the bit that helps them most develop their insights and their concepts of person-centeredness. And by third year, we find that they're actually challenging the practitioners about their traditional concepts of person-centeredness and actually co-developing them. We even have some of our practitioners helping them with their NMC revalidations and their reflections and challenging their own traditional concepts. So we do see that by third year. They kind of find it difficult in year one, year two. They even sometimes find they have a bit of a backward step, but by year three the penny drops, and we see that. So I do think it starts with the educators, but I also think it's about sometimes allowing the students to teach us something as both educators and as the practitioners.
Thank you, Neil. Maybe just from a European perspective as well, and then particularly the commentary around lecture practitioners, I think I'd like to emphasise it's not the role that is important. It's not the role that's going to change cultures. it's the person that's going to have the impact. So you could have someone in a lecturer practitioner role, and we have, I think, at our university, maybe in the region of 17 currently working in practice units, where our students are of a high percentage of the staff working on the unit, and they work closely with those to try and create the cultures where they can learn effectively. To assume that they are all aware of the meaning of person-centeredness, or person-centered in the way they exercise their responsibilities as a lecturer practitioner and the things they do with students and the way they interact with students, I would not dare to say that that is true. So I think, yes, lecturer practitioners could be one of the key figures who could increase the influence that we are trying to demonstrate globally. But there are many others, and I think we need to be looking at people and asking people challenging questions, as Neal was saying, daring to ask those challenging questions, because we are constantly in a state of being and becoming, as Tanya's message was at the beginning. So maybe Tanya, you'd like to wrap us off before we go to the next person?
Thank you very much, Neal, for your contribution. And Sean, you've just eloquently responded as I was going to respond. I agree. I don't think it's about role. I think it is your way of being. How have you journeyed with self on your person-centered journey? So I agree, and I would like to believe that I pride myself on how my values align in my everyday practice in the widest sense. But I want to pick up on Joanne's point, because it's a really important point around influencing strategically and influencing major kind of professional organizations. And I suppose my experience over the last 24 years is kind of this. You can't push at a closed door. I think organizations need to be ready to hear what you have to say. And I think that is a challenge, because people have mindsets and they can have very set ideas. So it's very, very tricky to try and push at a closed door. And what I found myself doing in the latter kind of these last few years is working with organizations who stretch out, who want to work with me. And I want to give a really beautiful example of work I've done in southeastern Sydney local health district in Australia, of which there are 8 facilities, healthcare facilities. And they asked me to help them develop a nursing and midwifery strategy. And it was beyond a joy, because they were ready. They were in a state of readiness. They knew what they wanted. They knew it was person-centeredness. They understood the philosophical underpinnings of the framework. And therefore, it became such a positive collaborative endeavor. But if you're trying to bring people on board who aren't ready and aren't at that stage, that's when it's very tricky. So I think it's about how we get people to a state of readiness and realize, oh yeah, this is definitely, not all of it, but this is definitely part of the solution for the future. So that's just my message. And it's not that Brendan and I haven't tried in many guises to influence. And sometimes you have to wait for that window of opportunity. And when you see it, you go for it.
So it's all about intervening just in time and just